Yes, it's time for a relationship conversation right here on the show. Miracle Ihuoma is a dynamic speaker, author, clinical psychologist, a life coach, and spiritual shepherd. He has worked with various individuals, families, and organizations as a family life therapist. For a decade now as a conference speaker and for 13 years, and a clinical psychologist for 5 years, and a prolific writer for 14 years. Anyways, on the show today, we will be discussing exploring intergenerational relationships. Are you into older partners? Well, this conversation is for you. Good
Good
morning.
morning.
How are you doing today?
Blessed. How about you?
I'm great. First off, let's establish what an intergenerational relationship is.
Yes. So basically, an intergenerational relationship is a relationship between two generations, right? Usually, the cap is 10 years, a 10-year difference between two partners, right? So where one person is at least 10 years older than the other person, they are said to be in two generations. So that's what intergenerational relationship is.
This is somewhat controversial, which also depends on the angle or, the way the perspective which you choose to see it. So first off, it is said, or there's a belief, or there's a certain narrative that ladies who are into older men have daddy issues. Is that true?
Well, that would be too generalistic
Okay.
or generic because it might not exactly be true for everybody.
Okay.
While it might be true for some people, it might not be true for everybody.
Everyone, okay.
There might be other reasons why certain people are into much more older men. Because when you say older men, virtual most ladies would want a man who is older than them, even if it's just 1 or 2, 3, 4 years. But I want to believe what you're talking about is maybe guys who are way, way older.
So now, how
Yeah.
old is too old? I think we also need to have that conversation. I'm going to come to the flip side of it.
Yeah.
But let's focus on the women for a minute. How old is too old for you to, be into a partner, who's way older than you? How old can be too old?
Well, that's also subjective because what I would say about that is you have to consider all the angles before you decide to be with somebody. Because you have to, if for instance you want to get married to somebody or you're with somebody who is say 20 years older than you want to look at all the angles like I said. So for instance, it means that if for instance you are 30 right now, the person would be 70 in the next 20 years when you are 50, right? The person would be, when you become 40, the person will be 60. So if you look at all the things surrounding that, the health complications, the issues with even sexuality and things like that, compatibility and all of, and you are okay with it, right? Why not? But my issue is, have you considered all of the options? Have you considered all of the advantages and maybe disadvantages of going into such relationship before you go into it?
Let's touch on some of those advantages and disadvantages because I know that mode of communication would be a problem, especially can be a problem.
Yeah.
I'll use my experience as an example, right? My partner is quite a number of years older than I am. And for a couple of years, communication was a problem because I am in a generation where submissiveness is not, it's not a key factor for us, right? Because I mean, we're in a partnership, so we need to speak to each other like equals. So it got to a time in our marriage where I had to realize that, well, he's going to play different roles, and I have to find a way to, align with that or relate with that. Let's talk about communication because it can be a problem somewhat. How do we bridge that gap in communicating with a partner who's who's many years older than you?
Yes. So that's why understanding is very important. So when you're getting married to somebody, you need to know what generation they belong to. For instance, there are typically about, say, 5 generations. So there is the baby boomers, the Generation X, the millennials, and then there is Gen Z, and now we have Generation Alpha, right? And of course, basically, when we talk about these different generations, it's actually when people are born, a particular time frame when people are born, But then you realize that in those time frames, there are things that affect, the birth of such people. So for instance, anybody born in this generation is born into technology, right? Is born into social media. That affects behavior, right? People have said that once a child gets born now, before the eyes used to be closed, now it's no longer closed, it's now open, right? It gives an example. It gives you an example of how things are right now, or different from how they used to be. So that changes the dynamic. So you're talking about something like submission, things like respect.
Exactly.
Now, it has a new definition now in this time and age. Before now, it was when an older person is talking to you, you can't talk back, you keep quiet. But because of social media, people have found expression through social media.
Yeah.
So now they don't see keeping quiet as a sign of respect. Yeah. So if, for instance, your partner is a generation Y, for instance, or a millennial, and is getting married to a Gen Z or Generation Alpha, who is after a Gen Z, and then he's talking to the person and maybe expects that the person would wait for him to finish before talking, and then she talks back at him, that can disrespectful. But when they understand that, okay, this is a different generation and they might not respond like I used to respond or how we were raised, then it would bring about more understanding in that relationship. So I think that understanding, the different generations helps people to communicate better, cut them some slack, and then look for middle grounds where, okay, this is really what I want, this is what I think about this, and then, incorporate what the other person thinks, and then you can find a middle ground.
Now let's talk about men who are into older women, because that also exists, and that is where the controversy usually, stems. That's where we find more, controversies, basically, because, there's that family renegades on it that no, you can marry this woman, And then there's also the flip side where he's being called or being considered or being looked at as a boy toy or a gold digger. There's so many names attributed to that, dynamics in a relationship. So how would you suggest or how would you advise that they handle those sort of, external pressures, also from extended family members?
Yes. So these are part of the things you have to also consider when going into such relationship, right? Okay, how are you going to deal with the culture in which you are living in, right? Especially if you're an African or you live in Africa, it's a bit
it's not
unusual,
accepted,
yes, for a guy to be marrying a lady who is older than him. So you have to look for ways to manage it, right? And you have to also consider it and say, even for guys who are getting married to older women, for instance, you have to also talk about the issue of respect. So how would that play out in your relationship?
An African man respecting a woman in a marriage
setting? Yeah. So for an African man, he expects the woman to be submissive, right, in some sort of way. And if you're getting married to an older woman, will she be as submissive as you want her to be?
Exactly.
So those are conversations you need to have, right, with her. And of course, you as the man, you need to also shield her from the community. And of course, it's your decision. So one way or the other, you have to live up to it. You have to own up to your decision.
All right.
And then, stand by it, whatever consequences come.
What I'm hearing from all of this is communication.
Yeah.
Find a way to communicate, approach a conversation in a very, very, very delicate manner. Thank you so much for this conversation, Miracle. I'm sure 1 or 2 people watching have learned so much from this topic on exploring intergenerational relationships. We'll continue again next week, right?
Yeah.
Fantastic. The show continues shortly, guys. Stay with us. We'll be right back.